EQ is short for equalization, and it allows us to adjust the amplitude of audio signals at specific frequencies. Think of the various EQ bands as frequency-specific volume knobs. Each type of EQ does this a little differently, so let's take a look at a few different types of equalizers. First up is parametric EQ. It's perhaps the most flexible because you can boost or suppress a selected frequency as well as the bandwidth of that frequency. Bandwidth can be wide or narrow depending on what you need to do. Now let me show you how I use it. Let's turn to the overhead drum mics. These microphones are closest to the rack tom, which results in getting a little too much of it in the overhead mics. Therefore, I need to notch out the frequency of the rack tom with an EQ. This requires a narrow frequency bandwidth because I want to be careful to not change the overall sound of the drums too much. We can find the frequency of the tom a couple different ways. First, find the EQ band that's closest to the tom frequency and then boost it. Sweep the frequency range of the tom until you hear it resonate, which sounds like this. Now we want to reduce that frequency by a few dB. Use the Q setting to widen, or in this case, to tighten up the bandwidth. Remember that we're trying to clean up or decrease the sound of the tom without overtly affecting the tone of the rest of the drum set. Start by making subtle adjustments. Once you've made a few adjustments to the EQ, remember to go back and listen to it in the context of the mix. In this case, let's hear how it sounds with the rest of the drum mics. Use the bypass buttons to see whether or not our EQ setting has been effective. Another way that we could find the frequency of the tom is by using an analyzer. This is what an analyzer looks like. With the analyzer, you can see the fundamental frequency of both toms and the snare at 100 Hz, 172 Hz, and 200 Hz, respectively. Let's turn to a vocal track. If I have too much sibilance in the voice, I'll use the same subtractive EQ technique to notch it out. I'll turn up a frequency band and then sweep it until I find the most offending frequency. Typically somewhere between 3000 Hz and 7000 Hz. And then I'll notch that out or turn it down. Once again, the bandwidth, also known as the Q setting, will allow me to change the width of the frequency band like this. Shelving EQ is used to evenly boost or suppress frequencies that are above or below a selected frequency. It's often included conveniently on the upper and lower bands of a parametric EQ. Allow me to demonstrate. Here's some audio of a Moog bass synthesizer. We can use the low frequency shelf to bring up the lows and the high frequency shelf to attenuate the highs. Another type of EQ that's very similar, and in some cases synonymous to shelving EQ, is called a high pass or a low pass filter. Everything above a selected frequency will pass through a high pass filter, just as everything below a selected frequency will pass through a low pass filter. For instance, I always use a high pass filter on a vocal mic, always. And this is what it looks like. We just don't need those extremely low frequencies to come through the mic, unless they're beatboxing, and this also helps to avoid plosives. The difference between the high and low pass filters in shelving EQ is that some EQ units will allow me to shape the area of the roll-off, whereas a shelf is typically flat. Finally, we have graphic EQ. Remember that EQ can be thought of as frequency-specific volume knobs. Well, graphic EQ clearly demonstrates this, since there is very little interaction between the frequency bands. So this type of EQ can easily be described as frequency-specific volume knobs. Now that we have a few different types of equalizers at our disposal, how do we use them to clean up the mix? I always start out by using subtractive EQ, but the first step is to familiarize yourself with the various frequency ranges using one of the aforementioned types of equalizers. I suggest using a chart like this as a guide at first, but always experiment and try stuff out, because that's the best way we learn. Every equalizer has a slightly different effect on the sound. As I said before, I always start with subtractive EQ. Practice on a familiar recording or sound and sweep a tight notch across the EQ graph like this. Here's how to do it on an analog mixing board. Here I am in front of a 16-channel Mackie mixing board. Let's see if we can find the frequency of the high tom using the onboard 3-band EQ. Let's use the same subtractive EQ technique to notch out the frequency of the high tom. First, I'm going to turn up the volume of the mid-range EQ knob, and then I'll sweep the EQ knob until the tom begins to resonate. Then we're going to notch it out. Now let's take a look at how to roll off sibilants on the voice. Notice how the high frequency band is fixed at 12,000 Hertz. So I'm going to roll off a touch of 12,000, and then I'll set the mid-range frequency knob to somewhere in the range of the sibilants. Let's say 4,000 Hertz in this case. And then we'll gently notch that out as well. So now you can hear how it's not as bright on the upper end of the frequency range. In addition to learning to differentiate between various frequencies, this will also help you to find areas in the frequency spectrum that resonate a little more than others. The room, or the mic, or the signal source may cause this resonance, but when we notch out some of these frequencies, it helps to clean up the sound. Once again, I always subtract frequencies before I add them. Something you may want to keep in mind is that the human vocal range is only from about 80 Hertz to about 1,000 Hertz. I hope that this video about EQ has been useful and helpful to you. Remember to always start with subtractive EQ before you consider adding frequencies to the signal, and make your adjustments subtle at first. Thanks for watching.